Alright, so this video should be fairly short and sweet because all we're going to be doing today is looking at some fun ways that you can use the collections functionality with your Steam Deck. And this entire video was actually inspired by a viewer who, in the comments, he and I were talking back and forth about, ways that he used collections specifically for this first method, which is to use it for completion status, but for the life of me, I could not find the original comment anywhere, so if you and I ever talked in the comments section about how to use collections to track your completion status for games, please let me know in the comments below again so we can talk about it some more because I couldn't find it anywhere. But all that being said, the first entry on this list, or one way that you can use collections effectively, is to use it to track your game completion status. And I honestly thought this was a really cool idea because at its core, depending on how much of a completionist you are, this could be incredibly helpful if you just want to keep track of the games that you're currently playing versus the ones that you've already beaten, or the ones that you hope to play someday if you, like me, struggle with having just a crazy big backlog of games that you hope to get around to at some point. And you could even take this a step further, really, and instead of just having games that you've completed in so much as you've rolled credits, you could also have a separate category defined in collections for games where you just 100% of the game and got every achievement imaginable, again, assuming that you are the sort of completionist that values that sort of thing. Personally speaking, if I had a collection that actually, outlined the games that I've 100% completed, it would be totally empty because, again, I'm kind of a buffet-style gamer who tends to hop around a lot of games based on the kind of work I do here on the channel, but nonetheless, if you are the sort of gamer who likes to keep a razor-sharp focus on the games that you've made significant progress on, or the ones that you just don't want to lose track of amidst the chaos of all of your gaming habits like I do, then I think this is actually a really cool way to go about it and a very practical use for the collections functionality. But hey, if you're not the super structured type and you're really not that concerned with how much completion status you have on a particular game, but you are very concerned with how certain games make you feel, then you might try this next collection idea, which would be to group your games into related thematic clusters. For instance, you might create collections for things like cozy games, or indie darlings, or games that really just sort of put out like an esoteric vibe, really more than just adhering to a specific genre structure, like just third-person action games or puzzle games or something like that. And while a lot of those experiences do tend to slide into the same genres over and over, that's not necessarily always the case, and as an extension of that, you might be able to create a collection that just focuses on a thematic similarity between games that might be in totally different genres. One that I just randomly thought of while I was putting together the outline for this video would be if you like games where you just have a lone hero who's facing down legions of enemies rather than, say, a team of random misfits like something like Guardians of the Galaxy. And if you are the type that might have been into like the Lone Heroes example that I laid out, that might include games like Sekiro or the Arkham series, where you really are just sort of a single force of nature against the world, as it were. Well, I mean, technically speaking, I guess Batman has Alfred, but you know what I mean. Or maybe in keeping with the same theme, you like to group games by their emotional impact. For instance, there are lots of games that I played before that really resonated with me in almost like a melancholic type way that I wouldn't normally revisit in my day-to-day, but it might still be nice to keep an eye on them for like a rainy day or sometime when I'm feeling particularly introspective and cozy, like What Remains of Edith Finch, for example. Not a happy, feel-good game, by the way, but if it was kind of like a rainy day outside or something like that, and again, I was feeling particularly introspective, it might be cool to have a collection of games that just made you feel a certain way so you can access them quickly if you're in that type of mood. And speaking of rainy days, this next one's going to sound a little bit weird because I don't know if I've ever even talked to another gamer who shares the affinity that I do for what I call seasonal gaming, and that would be to create collections that basically align games with the current weather patterns of the season that you're currently in. I know that sounds completely weird, but let me elaborate on that a little bit. I love the game Metal Gear Solid, right? And when I first played it, I believe it was summertime. But my favorite time to explore that game would be in the dead of winter because in Metal Gear Solid, you're exploring the Shadow Moses complex in the snowy outbacks of Alaska. On the flip side, in the middle of summertime, that's when I tend to gravitate towards bright, colorful, more cheery games in the vein of something like Rocket League or Hi-Fi Rush. So naturally, you could create a collection for each season, I guess, if you wanted to, and, for me, I would definitely just absolutely load up a fall collection with tons and tons of cozy games, but yeah, you get the idea. But taking that just a step further and beyond the raw literal seasons that a lot of us go through in any given year, you might also apply the same mentality to seasons of your life. And it's funny because this is something I hadn't considered until I was in the middle of writing this outline, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. For instance, there were certain games that I absolutely adored in my childhood that would, constitute a lot of emulated titles perhaps, but then also there were certain games that I played when I was a teenager or when I was in my 20s, and if you asked me to make a collection just for my 20s, it would probably only need to have the Halo Master Chief collection in it because because honestly I was huge into those games throughout most of the 2000s. Admittedly, this is kind of a weird use of the collections functionality, but the more I thought about it, the more it did seem to make sense. And I guess if you're like me and also see the Steam Deck as kind of this portal to your gaming history, like I mentioned in that Why the Steam Deck Feels Like Home video from a couple weeks ago, this actually might not be a terrible use of it. And while we're on the subject of seasons of your life and how that ties into your gaming history and how that might be used with the collections functionality of the Steam Deck, this next one is kind of aligned with that theme and a little bit more pragmatic, but you could use collections on the Steam Deck to track how much of an investment it is to play certain games. And what I mean by that is there are some games that are inherently quick to pick up and play, right? These are games that, you can play in bite-sized little chunks without having to dedicate hours of time to it to fully appreciate. But then on the flip side, you've got these really big, beefy, like narrative-heavy games in the vein of something like Elden Ring, which also has a lot of mechanical depth, and it might be that based on your schedule that one might be preferable to the other. I frequently hear from parents here on the channel, and usually I'll see comments that the Steam Deck is so helpful because it lets them squeeze in time to play where they can, given that they tend to have a fluctuating schedule amidst the chaos of parenting. But on the flip side, you might be the sort of person who can spend really focused amounts of time, and when you do that, you might want to make sure you're jumping into an experience that really warrants that kind of investment. Something like Red Dead 2, for example, is a slow, meandering game, but ultimately one that is incredibly fulfilling if you have the time to devote to it. So I think this is especially useful if you're somebody who is in the former camp, where you only have a few minutes to play here and there and it might be unpredictable when you can play, because then you can keep those games that you're most likely to get the most enjoyment out of front and center without having to paw through your entire library to find them. And finally, this last collection idea is really for the more technically minded or people who like tinkering or really demand the absolute best performance, and that would be to go ahead and group collections by their specific performance on the Steam Deck. So in this scenario, you might create different collections for games that work really well, games that really don't work that well at all, or games that you're still tinkering with to see if you can find that right balance between performance and frame rate. Because even though it's really helpful that in Steam a lot of the games are designated as being Steam Deck compatible, if you're somebody who spent a lot of time with the Steam Deck, you know that this doesn't always tell the whole story. Because even though a game may be deck verified and run great at 30 FPS, it may not necessarily play great according to your exacting standards, and if you're a purist, you may demand at least 40 FPS or 60 FPS depending on what you're after for your gameplay experience. So in this case, rather than simply relying on the Steam Deck verified status within your library, then you could actually just load up collections with games you've personally tested and with settings that you know work well, and just immediately jump into those games whenever you feel the need to. And as an extension of that, you could also create a collection for games that have a forthcoming update. It's not uncommon for developers or publishers to kind of communicate to their fans that further Steam Deck optimizations are on the way in a future patch, so you might find that while a game doesn't work great initially on the Steam Deck, you may still really be interested in it, and knowing that a patch is on the way for it, you could drop it into one of these collections to remind you to check in on it periodically rather than let it slip into the abyss of your backlog or just get lost somewhere in your library. Ultimately, the Steam Deck library functionality is super flexible on its own, allowing you to search through and filter your library to find very specific types of games. But sometimes you want a little bit more control outside of just the favorites functionality for keeping a closer eye on those titles, and I think these represent some really cool ways that you might do that, whether you're just more emotionally minded when you start thinking about the gameplay experiences you want, or if you take a more pragmatic approach that's more purely focused on performance. But hey, these are just a few random examples that I had read about in the comments or come up with on my own, but what about you? Are there any specific ways that you use collections that I haven't outlined here or that you would suggest to other players? If so, I would love to hear about it in the comments below, and I'm sure the community would as well. And as far as what's coming up on the channel, soon I'll be taking a look at games that seem retro but definitely are not retro, and then next up we'll definitely be taking a look at some of the games that are coming out in February since that is quickly approaching. So, as always, thanks so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel and watching the videos. It means a ton to me. Have an amazing day, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.